Hi everyone, and welcome to the March meeting of the Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force. Thank you to everyone who has joined. We've got a great presentation for you today. But before we get started, I just want to go around the room and do some introductions. So I'm Caitlin Snyder at the National Housing Conference.
Ethan Handelman from the National Housing Conference.
Jonathan Horowitz from the Low-Income Investment Fund.
Great, and we've got a bunch of folks online too. So again, thank you for tuning in. And we're going to get started with some policy updates. So our first policy update is on the appropriations and the President's budget process. So the President's budget was released 2 weeks ago now, and the appropriations process is going, however slowly that may be, but it is going. And Secretary Castro was in front of the House Appropriations Committee last week to testify on the President's budget, and he'll be in front of the Senate Appropriations Committee next week. Paul Ryan is hoping for the 12 separate subcommittee bills to be released before Easter recess, but that is quickly approaching. And he's hoping for regular order, but we'll see if that happens. The brewing fight over Justice Scalia's replacement and the early release for conventions in July is going to make that a tricky process, but we'll see where it goes. And I encourage all of you.
Caitlin, sorry, Ethan, I'm just jumping in. One of the other challenges that's going on is in the House on the Republican side, you have a subset of the majority, right? There are some Republican legislators who want to back away from the budget agreement that Senator Patty Murray and then Representative now Speaker Paul Ryan negotiated that set the overall funding limits for last year and for this year, and they want to cut more. So if the House can stick to the budget targets, the Senate will probably stick to the budget targets. There's a chance of getting all the appropriations bills done in regular order or an omnibus. If they don't, if the House goes its own way and wants to cut more spending, it's going to make reaching agreement a lot harder. So that's one of the monkey wrenches that may come in.
Exactly. And to follow up on that, I just want to encourage everyone to check out our budget forum that we hosted last week now. It's up on our website, and we can send around the link in the follow-up email, but we had some great speakers from HUD and from across the country that are doing some affordable housing work, and I encourage you to check that out along with our 2016 housing landscape that we released coinciding with the budget forum.
And one of the nice features of Housing Landscape, which documents the affordable housing challenges facing working families, so folks where at least someone in the household is working 20 hours a week or more, there are tailored state and metro level reports that you can take in your meetings with legislators, in your discussions with state officials, with federal officials, to help outline and bring home the affordable housing challenges that folks in your area are facing. So you'll see links to those. I think they're not up today, but they will be up shortly. And I do recommend the budget webinar to go back and view that recording because it's got in-depth in some of the interesting and more technical aspects of the budget proposal.
And now an update on the hardest hit fund.
So this is Rebecca with NHC. Can you guys hear me okay?
Sounds great.
Okay, perfect. So we sent this out last week in our Restoring Neighborhoods weekly email, but just wanted to touch on it again. Treasury has announced the allocation of $2 billion in additional hardest hit funding. So for this first phase, they are using an allocation formula based on a state's population and their utilization of their previous hardest hit awards. And states will have until 2020 to spend this additional money, but they must have used at least 50% of their existing allocation and have submitted their intent to accept the additional funding by this Friday, March 4th. There will be a second phase of funding via an application process open to all participating HFAs and housing finance agencies, and they have until next Friday to submit their applications, and they can request up to 50% of their existing allocation or $250 million, whichever is lower. Treasury really wants to support places that are still really struggling with foreclosure-related issues, so they're doing the second phase that way, and I think that's all I want to say about that.
Well, I would just add, Rebecca, this is Ethan, I think it's encouraging that Treasury got this money out pretty quickly, that this was a repurposing of money kind of left over in TARP, for those of you who remember back to 2008, 2009. and they had to walk a pretty difficult line between just putting out a formula that put all this money out to the exact same states that got the hardest hit funds. What they chose to do was recognize that some states had made more progress than others, but also make sure that everyone who was hardest hit did receive some help, and then had this competitive aspect of it that opens it up to all states, not just those who were originally identified several years ago as hardest hit, just because there's change over time and the need really varies. I'm hopeful for that process. All right, so you said you were done. That means it's my turn. Sorry, not reading the notes. So there was an interesting speech earlier this week from the Treasury Deputy Assistant Secretary Monique Rollins about the private label securities market. Some of you may remember that the PLS market rode the wave of the housing boom and felt the pain of the housing bust, that it really disappeared in the financial crisis and the resulting housing crash. It hasn't bounced back. Most mortgages at this point are still federally backed through Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, VA, etc. Treasury has been sort of organizing, sort of hosting, but not really leading conversations among PLS market participants, right? Bond issuers, lenders, securitizers, to try and get that started again, to try and figure out what the barriers are to bring private capital back and find ways to get it started. This speech summarized some of those efforts. It concluded with an exhortation to participants to keep working on it. It did not say that Treasury was going to keep working on it. So, I am not on the inside of these conversations, but reading between the lines, it sure seems like this was a, hey, we tried, you all should keep working on it kind of speech. Again, I could be wrong, I often am, but I would not expect, a brand new PLS initiative to come from Treasury. They did put out, or said they would put out, I haven't seen the actual link yet, some detailed descriptions of the issues explored and raised in those discussions, and some proposals for different structures that maybe could work according to some participants, but they did not get consensus, and the speech emphasized we did not reach a consensus point. So, more will still be written about how capital is going to flow into the mortgage market. Certainly, we still need housing finance reform to rebuild the system that broke in 2008. But I think it's worth keeping an eye on both how these structures will emerge and how they will work, for better or ill, in places that are still struggling to dig out from the foreclosure crisis. That we don't want to see structures put into place that limit the flow of capital to areas that need it. And there's a risk, especially when capital providers are quite reasonably skittish about extending credit in the mortgage space again, to over-caution limiting deploy of capital that could make a good return and reach areas that are important. If you've been watching our weekly newsletters, you'll see that some lenders are starting to innovate low down payment products outside of the FHA structure, and I think those are promising. That's why we're sending you out links to them so you can look at them and think about how they're working in the communities you work in. But this is really an area where we all need to keep paying attention and participate to make sure that communities that are still struggling to be restored have access to capital. So that's all I have. You will get a link to the speech and once it's available, to the other resources that Treasury puts out in the notes.
Great, thank you, Ethan. And I want to hand it over now to Shannon Ross for an update on the Capital Magnet Fund.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. This is Shannon Ross with the Housing Partnership Network. I am happy to report that the Capital Magnet Fund application is finally open. So this is something we've been anxiously anticipating since Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were directed to collect fees for the Capital Magnet Fund from the National Housing Trust Fund at the end of 2014. So the application is now open. For those of you not familiar with the program, it was created in HERA in 2008. Like I said, it's funded by fees on new business for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and is kind of a sister program in the National Housing Trust Fund. They have the same funding source. The Capital Magnet Fund is administered by the CDFI Fund at the Department of Treasury, but is open to both certified CDFIs and nonprofits that work in housing management and development. So, if you're not a CDFI, it's still something that's worth looking at. As I said, the application round is currently open. The first deadline is March the 16th, and that's a grants.gov deadline to submit an SF424. And then the completed application and supporting materials is due on March the 30th. The Capital Magnet Fund people at Treasury have not officially announced how much money is available, but our friends of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition estimate, based on Fannie and Freddie's performance last year, that it'll be $104 million. So that is about $20 million more than was available in the first funding round in 2010. So that's good news. As it's also good news that this will hopefully be an annual source of money. The one thing I want to highlight is the changes between the 2016 round and the 2010 round. I know people were pretty happy, with some of the program requirements in the 2010 round, or might be relying on those going forward. As the Capital Magnet Fund staff at the CDFI Fund is fond of pointing out, no one that was on staff then is on staff anymore, or it's totally new set of rules written by totally new staff. You can imagine there'll be new reviewers, so it's worth reading all of the application materials to make sure that you're hitting the things that they want this round. Some key differences I just wanted to call out. They've changed it so it aligns more closely. The affordability requirements align better with the low-income housing tax credit. Before they were more home-esque requirements. It also changes the leverage, so you don't get more points for doing more leverage, but you do get points for types of leverage, so that's worth looking at. And again, it's not worth getting into on this call, but if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me or to the CDFI Fund. And that's the last thing I want to say is shout out to the CDFI Fund website. It's pretty comprehensive, cdfifund.gov/CMF. You'll find the NOFAs up there, the interim rule is up there. It's interim final rule, but it's up there. The frequently asked questions are up there, and they've been updating them. They're updated as recently as Friday, so that's worth checking out. They also did a series of trainings that have kind of an overview of the program, and the slides from that are available as well. So I'd encourage you all to check that out, but and put in applications.
Great. Thank you, Shannon.
Shannon, one quick follow-up to that. I had heard from some folks at the Capital Magnet Fund that they are also looking for reviewers. So not from folks applying for money, right? But if you have expertise in this space and want to do effectively piecework, they are looking for that. They've circulated a posting for it. I don't know if there's one on the website. I sort of hope there is because I need to tweet out the link. But I would encourage people to explore that if you're interested and not also at an organization applying for funds.
Great. And now we'll hand it over to Jonathan, who will introduce Rachel.
Great. So first, let's just make sure Rachel's there. Are you there, Rachel? Oh, excellent. As mentioned before, I'm Jonathan Horowitz. I'm Director for Public Policy here at LIF. And I'm going to stop talking shortly because I'm extremely pleased to introduce Rachel Bluestein, who I'm realizing I'm not sure exactly when you joined LIF, Rachel, as a full-time employee. Are you up to 6 months now, or
yes.
Is it a year? I say that because Rachel was working for us previously as a consultant on one of our special initiatives, Partners in Progress, which we may mention in a little bit. And so it was a very seamless transition to her current position as Vice President for Special Projects and Special Initiatives. And she will be talking about what I think is one of the really exciting capital product. LIF has been working for a long time looking at how can we support organizations that are trying to affect neighborhood change. And as I mentioned, we had a Partners in Progress set of grants to help support community quarterbacks, one of whom is actually a recipient of Equity with a Twist. And this, I think, is a really very interesting product, and Rachel is really in charge of implementing it. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to the task force for inviting me to talk about this product. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great.
Okay, great. Thanks. So as Jonathan mentioned, I am the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives and Programs here at LIFT. And one of the projects and products that I've been working on is Equity with a Twist, which I'll be talking about more in depth. First, just want to give you a very quick background on LIFT. Probably most of you are familiar with our work. We are a CDFI, and with a 30-year history of investing in communities and families. And this just gives you a sense of our priorities. What I wanted to really start out by saying, and Jonathan alluded to it a moment ago, is that LIFT strategically has been moving towards trying to focus on and support holistic and integrated approaches towards community development. So, you know, like any traditional CDFI, we have done many, many housing deals, many charter schools, many child care facilities. We have a specialty in equitable transit-oriented development, and we do health clinics, or we have a health focus both with FQHCs as well as a healthy foods initiative. So we're interested in all of these things, but we've been trying to really think intentionally about how we can support people who are doing multiple efforts under all of that touch sort of all of these areas to really have a very powerful impact in their communities. And Jonathan mentioned that my first responsibility at LIFT when I was a consultant for more than a year before joining was to manage the Partners in Progress program, which was funded by the Citi Foundation and supported 14 quarterbacks, community quarterbacks who were working in communities across the nation. And they were, their charge was to organize a collaborative of multiple partners who were going to work together on creating a vision and a plan, and then really implementing the plan to affect their communities in multiple ways. We've also been, for example, targeting our new markets allocation towards projects that have more than one aspect to them. So a charter school that includes a health clinic, or a new grocery store in a food desert that's connected to a health clinic. So there are ways that we're trying to encourage collaboration and integration, and perhaps the most recent and most integrated of them is this Equity with a Twist. Equity with a Twist is a new product that we are piloting. We got a $3 million grant from JPMorgan Chase Foundation, and we paired that with a $3 million of LIFT's own capital to create a $6 million pilot pool. The product itself is enterprise-level product for community connectors. And what we mean by community connectors is an organization that's working in a particular community that is affecting at least the 3 core areas that you see here of mixed income housing, child development and early learning programs, and K-12 education programs. And so Equity with a Twist is an enterprise level product that offers long-term, 10-year, low-cost capital for these organizations that's also very, very flexible. So not project-level finance, not secured. It's really meant to provide these organizations the support to do the highly complex integrated work that they do. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide, we're trying to accelerate their work and their impact. And while we want to demonstrate to the financial community that there could be a modest financial return as well as a high social return on this type of work. An important piece of the product is its rigorous focus on outcomes. So in return for this long-term, flexible, low-cost capital, the borrowers are required to track a set of outcomes that measure social impact. And I've listed out the 5 required outcome areas. They're public safety, health and well-being, child development. We're trying to get at educational progress by looking at 3rd grade reading and math scores, and then something that measures local market strength. So that could be vacancy rates or blight or housing prices. And just as we're flexible in the structure of this financing, we're also very flexible in the way that organizations agree to measure the outcomes, as long as they measure each one of these 5 items. So we talk at length with each of our community connector organizations to figure out for their work and for their community what the right target population is and what the right measurement is to measure this impact, and where, how to figure out what the baseline values are so that we can show improvement. And so, of course, we're predicting that concentrated investment in multi-sector community development should lead to improvement in social metrics. We have closed 2 of the first transactions in the pilot. One went to Bridge Housing Corporation in California, and one to the Bayou Development Foundation in New Orleans. So I'll just describe each of these a little bit. As I'm sure many of you are familiar with Bridge, I won't go into too much detail. They are a very large housing developer in California. You may know that they're doing 2 large redevelopments of public housing, one at Potrero Terrace in San Francisco and the other in Jordan Downs and Watts in Los Angeles. We closed a $2 million transaction with them at the end of December. And these 2 redevelopments are huge. The San Francisco one is part of Hope SF. They'll cost more than $1 billion in total. They're replacing public housing units, 1-for-1, 1,300 public housing units, but they're also adding up to 1,700 new units with a range of affordability. So all the way from public housing to tax credit, affordable housing to market rate housing. In addition, they're really rethinking the physical space of those communities, especially in Potrero. I don't know if some of you have visited there, but it's very, very isolated from the other neighborhoods that it's right next to. The street grid, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the street grids don't connect. They don't really go through. So, you can be walking along in this complex and then just hit a dead end, literally in a pile of garbage or something, so that you can't progress. And there's some very fancy neighborhoods around it, but they're really disconnected, and they're disconnected in terms of transportation as well. It's extremely hilly, so for people with mobility issues and the elderly, it's very, very hard to walk around in the neighborhood. They're going to replane and regrade the neighborhood and connect the streets through, so that all the streets are through streets that connect to the surrounding neighborhoods. They're creating additional green and recreational space. They're creating new buildings that have nice courtyards and recreational space within them, as well as shared community facility, new community centers, lots of new features that will include recreational space and retail as well. One thing that's really unique about what Bridge is doing is that they have been on site as an organization since 2012, doing what they call trauma-informed community building, which is really readying the residents for change. And they've been phasing in a number of services and supports. I've only listed a few of them here. They have programs related to health, to seniors, to children. They have out-of-school time programs. They have community health leaders. They have tutors and mentors and job training and lots and lots and lots of different kinds of services. But they go about it in a way they call trauma-informed community building that's really very much participatory with the residents, driven by the residents' needs and desires, really trying to be very respectful and inclusive and address the trauma that the people living in poverty have been experiencing, as well as the trauma of having multiple service providers over the years come and say that they're going to make change in the area and then seeing that nothing really ever happens. So there's a lot of building trust, and there's a lot of services being provided that housing developers may not typically do. And this has been very transformative for Bridge as an organization. They now think of themselves not just as a housing developer, but as a community development organization. And they've staffed up for that, both in their headquarters and on site at Bridge and at Potrero and Jordan Downs. And so what they're using our Equity with a Twist funding for is really to pay for that staff and those services in advance of when they'll start getting developer fees and rents from market rate housing. So we're sort of a bridge to that cash flow, which might start coming in 5 or 6 years from now. They can use our funds to pay for these important services now. So that's Potrero today and Potrero in the future. Just to quickly talk about Bayou development, and then we'll open it up for questions. This is a group that was formed in the aftermath of Katrina to redevelop the Columbia Park neighborhood in New Orleans, which is the site of a former St. Bernard public housing project, which was an area of concentrated poverty and very, very high crime. Our investment in them also closed this past December. BDF is a purpose-built community, so they take part in the Cradle to College model. They have mixed income housing. They have an EduCare Center, which is a high-quality early learning center. A mobile health clinic, which at some point they hope will come out of the trailer and get its own facility. They have gardens, they have park, and the parts of the plan that they're still working on include a K-12 school, a grocery, a pharmacy, and they have a golf course nearby, which in partnership with the city they are managing and running, which will provide sustaining funds to the project over time. They also have a lot of supports and services for their residents, case management, health programs, financial literacy, after school. And they are using our investment to accelerate the charter school project. So we're essentially serving as a bridge to fundraising. So rather than having to wait 5 or 6 years to raise all the funds that they would need for their equity piece to be able to do a charter school facility transaction, they can use our Equity with a Twist funds for that now, and they'll use fundraising to pay us back. And this is just a quick before and after of what Columbia Park looked like after the flood. You can see the public housing was completely submerged, moldy, and uninhabitable. And what it looks like today, they have lovely housing and parks. I couldn't show sort of a total site plan, but they have parks, they have playgrounds, community garden, senior housing, and in the 1,000 units of mixed income housing, it's a third public, affordable, and market rate, and they're mixed in, so nobody needs to know which apartments are at which rate, and all the finishes and all the amenities are identical. It's really very, very lovely housing and a great opportunity for anyone who can live there. Just to close up our next step for Equity with a Twist, we are working on our final pilot transaction, which we should be closing this year. We are thinking about how to scale the program, potentially seeking additional investors to help us do that. And we're starting the hard work of tracking the outcomes, which, as I'm sure you all have experienced, is very challenging, but very worthwhile if we're going to really demonstrate the effectiveness of all of these programs. And I'll stop there and see if any questions have come in.
Rachel, thank you very much. It's Ethan here at NHC. That is fascinating. It's raised questions that I have. What I'm going to do is start asking you stuff and give folks who are on the webinar time to ask questions via the Q&A box. So folks, if you want to take a look on that right-hand panel on the webinar, there's a Q&A box. You can type in questions. Then we will pose them to Rachel, and she will attempt to answer them. Meanwhile, I will ask you some stuff because this is really interesting, and it's causing me to think, oh, what about X? And first on my list is how you structure the equity investment. Equity investments in development organizations are not unheard of, but they're unusual, especially on the nonprofit side. When you talk about getting paid back, is this more like a short-term or a long-term note, a soft loan? Help me understand the financial side of the structuring.
Sure, and I'll just start by saying the title Equity with a Twist is a little bit, can be a little confusing to folks because it is not literally an equity investment, and I should have said that up front. We wanted it to feel equity-like to the organizations that we're supporting in the sense that it is not secured, it's extremely flexible, it's risky capital because it's not secured, but it is in fact structured in many ways like a loan. It's a 10-year term. We have an agreement with them. We're not taking any ownership position. That's not actually possible with a nonprofit, as I'm sure you know. So right. It's more of a loan agreement, but the repayment structure is entirely flexible. So they really tell us how the repayment would work best for what they're working on. For example, Bridge expects that they will start getting certain types of reimbursable expenses and developer fees in year 6 of their project. And so they have structured that they'll start to pay principal in year 6, and they'll pay us back in equal slugs in year 6 through 10. Bayou Foundation, on the other hand, is thinking that even if they could raise funding for their school project, they would like to be able to recycle this money into their next project. So maybe they achieve the school facility and then they want to work on the grocery. They have the flexibility to do that. They're going to pay us back at the end of the 10-year period. So we do expect to get paid back, but the structure is very flexible. And then in terms of sort of debt service or interest or yield, that's also somewhat flexible. They were able to choose whether they wanted to pay a current payment for that or pay us all, defer it all to the end. They both chose a current payment, but that wasn't necessary, and they're also able to defer in a particular year in certain circumstances. So again, it's very flexible, and perhaps that's a little bit more equity-like in the sense of deferrable payment.
That's really interesting, and I see why you call it equity-like. But I'm also glad to hear you say that you do, in fact, expect to be paid back because it makes it fun. Yeah, it's fundamentally different from a capacity-building grant that is, hey, go build your thing.
Yep,
so
absolutely.
It sort of stops there.
Yep, and it is recourse. I mean, you'll notice that the first two organizations we picked, or at least those of you familiar with Bridge, it's a high-capacity organization, and this is a pilot. We consider it a lot riskier than the typical lending that we do because it is flexible and it is unsecured, although it is recourse to this organization. But we're starting out with high-capacity organizations because we do want to make sure that they can pay us back. And I would say two things about that. One is you're absolutely right. We are trying to demonstrate that enterprise-level lending or enterprise-level investments are less risky than people think, that this kind of investment can lead to a return of capital, a modest return. I mean, the coupons and these things are very, very below market, but a great social return. And we think that that'll appeal to a certain profile of impact investors and other mission-driven investors who really want to support innovative approaches. And I can tell you that these organizations are extremely excited about getting this kind of capital. Those of us who've worked in nonprofit finance for a while know that unrestricted operating capital, which is kind of what this is extremely hard to come by, and especially long-term, low cost. They're absolutely thrilled, and they do think that it's going to be critical to accelerating their missions. These may be organizations that could have gotten there 6 to 10 years from now, but what we're trying to do is really accelerate that impact and allow them to achieve those outcomes now.
This is Jonathan. Just to follow up on that a little bit, I think it's interesting. It's had like equity with a twist sounds a little better than debt with a leap of faith. One question I have for you, Rachel, is Bridge Housing is an organization that was a PIP grantee, and we just talked a little bit about sort of the fact that this isn't grant capital. I'm wondering if there's anything in terms of the conversations with Bridge, sort of how they see the work they're doing with Equity with a Twist as related to or distinct from what they've been doing as a community quarterback, and sort of how they view this money relative to that money. I don't mean versus, but sort of how they're thinking about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because they are participating in both programs. Partners in Progress, just to give a little more color around that, the grant size was reasonably large for a nonprofit organization. It was $125,000 each year for 2 years. They used that money to play the community quarterback role, and we had very specific responsibilities that went along with that. And so, they had to identify all the partners. When I talk about them doing all of these different and providing all of these different kinds of services to their residents, there's a list of 30 things that they have going on site related to schools and health and transportation and all kinds of other things. Playing the community quarterback role meant identifying all of those partners, bringing them all together, going through visioning exercise, going through a strategic planning exercise, signing MOUs with them so that it was very clear what each partner would be doing relative to the community. Convening meetings, action teams, and starting to implement. So the PIP grant was really seed capital to fund that role, and it allowed them to kickstart those collaboratives that then are now up and running and providing all of these services and coordinating in supporting the residents on site. The EQT capital really follows very nicely from that, because if you look at the PIP money as kind of seed capital to get that role, to get them trained up and launched in that role, and then the EQT money, which is much larger, $2 million, to support them rolling out and managing all of the work that they're doing with the residents. So it's kind of like a small amount of seed capital then led to the need for a much larger investment as they roll out and implement all of these programs. and where that initial capital didn't need to get paid back, this larger investment does, but that is doable because it's wrapped into this development project that they're doing, which will eventually cash flow for them. Although, you know, we're sort of bridging support of all of those services that will not provide them with cash flow. Does that answer your question, Jonathan?
Yeah, I know that both of these sources have been really valuable. I know that sort of our CEO is in talking with their folks that they're just really excited about equity with a twist. I also just thought it would be helpful given that they were in both. So that was great.
It's Ethan again. I'm curious, is there a program evaluation component of this where, because it's so new, because it's so innovative, you're kind of collecting data, collecting information as it progresses to think about next phases, next iterations of it, how it'll work?
If what you mean by program evaluation is a very formal kind of academic evaluation, we're not...
Any form, sort of a lesson, at some point a lessons learned exercise.
Oh, yes, I'm sure. This is an innovative product for LIF, and we tend to, yes, we love lessons learned. I'm sure that at some point there will be a paper or a convening or some kind of collection of lessons and sort of not an academic evaluation in the sense of having a third-party evaluator evaluate the program, but some sort of musing on the experience. Absolutely. We don't have anything formal planned at the moment since we're literally still trying to get the money out the door and focusing on just beginning to measure baselines and outcomes. But I'm sure that we will, we will do some consideration of the program at some point.
Got it. And at this point, you've made the awards that you're going to make, and you're going to see how it's going, or are there more in the pipeline?
So we had raised a $6 million pool. We've made two $2 million investments. So we have one more in the works. I can't discuss it in detail yet, but we would hope to close that. Our fiscal year is June 30. So my goal is to close the third one by then. That time is sneaking up on me, but that's the goal. And then we'd be out of money for the pilot, and so then it'll really be a question of investigating whether we can scale this product by finding interested investors.
Right. And that will, I'm sure, in part depend on early results, so it's good to be focusing on those already. We haven't had any questions come in through the webinar yet, but I am full of them, and I suspect Jonathan has more. So I think we'll keep going for a little bit. Jonathan, did you want to jump in, or do you want me to keep going?
You go ahead. I have one that's a little later.
Gotcha. Okay. So I am curious how the equity with a twist investment, I know it's a debt structure, but it's effectively an investment, how that is perceived by the other lenders that these nonprofits are working with. So, Bridge is doing this redevelopment that's connected to Hope SF, and I know it's doing other property investments. Is it, I would think it would be a positive sign and not sort of a, oh, someone else has claim on your funds issue, but are you having interactions with other parts of the lending community around essentially the other deals that your grantees, not grantees, but your equity with twist partners are doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have not been talking to the other lenders beyond sometimes trying to understand, as part of our underwriting, trying to understand their other debt. but I agree with you. I think the other lenders should think of this as a very positive influx of cash. It is unsecured, so we don't have a claim. You know, we're not competing with them for any particular assets. We don't have any liens that are going to interfere with any of their claims. We do expect to eventually get paid back, but we would obviously be much more flexible as a friendly lender. And, you know, psychologically, we know that we would be behind a secured lender. So I don't think there's a real conflict. You know, during the underwriting, we did include all the other debt that these organizations have, and because Bridge especially is, you know, they're a major developer, they have a lot of debt, and they have 1 million entities, which was, you know, a task to sort through when we're doing the underwriting. We wanted to make sure that it seemed like they would be able to pay all their debt and us as well. But we got comfortable with that, and I'm sure that the other lenders would as well.
Right, and I mean, when you refer to them having a lot of entities, that's primarily because multifamily is project finance, and there is at least one, if not several, LLCs created for every property developed. It's not
exactly.
It's not uncommon for a developer to have many of those entities as separate entries on their books.
Right, right, exactly. And some of them, sometimes they hold assets, sometimes they don't. They have operating entities. They have, they've actually set up a new entity to deal with all these services, you know, which is a new thing for them as an organization. So that entity doesn't have debt, but it might hold contracts. It might be receiving and then paying out payments for services. So, you know, they're a very complex organization. It was interesting to get to know them well. Bayou Development Foundation is less complex. They are a foundation, so they fundraise and spend.
Right.
You know, they're just almost like a zero-sum game. You know, the money, they fundraise money and then they spend it on projects. So, but they have sponsored, you know, for example, Educare, the child care organization, was a New Markets tax credit project, and they, Bayou Development Foundation, served as the borrower there, the sponsor. So they have some experience with complex financial transactions, but not nearly as much as a bridge type organization would.
Sure, and so that's interesting. As you describe it, I hadn't made that connection. It seems like the results of the equity within Twist investment would be different in character from Bridge versus Bayou Development. I know you're working on a third, and that may look different from the other two, but you know, Bridge is it's a nonprofit, but it's a business. They're doing projects, they're generating fees, they're now probably going to be generating at least some level of service income, versus a raise and spend approach. That must be very different to underwrite.
Yes, it's very different. I mean, in the sense of Bayou Development Foundation, we really, you know, I don't want to make it sound like Jonathan said, what did you say, debt with a leap of faith? But it's kind of a good description. You know, when you're bridging fundraising, you really have to believe that past performance predicts future results, right? Like, all we had to go on was that they have done an incredible job of fundraising in the past, enough to do all of the development that they've done to date. But we can only hope that they'll continue to do that and be able to pay us back in 10 years. It's you know, it's a very different kind of lending than we're used to. But they're a terrific organization, and they, in a way, it's interesting because they really have focused on just this one small neighborhood in New Orleans that they know extremely well, and that they are rebuilding from the ground up to have, you know, all the elements of a highly functioning neighborhood with not just housing, but parks and a school and health and grocery and pharmacy, all located in a relatively small physical area. So they're really dedicating themselves to creating a very targeted model of a healthy, vibrant community.
Got it. So I think we have 2 more questions. Rebecca King has a question, and then we'll have Jonathan go last. Rebecca, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go for it.
Okay. Rachel, I was just wondering, since I know it's a pilot program, what LIF is kind of hoping to see comes out of this Equity with a Twist. I know you mentioned, showing enterprise-level investing is less risky than previously thought, but kind of what other outcomes you're hoping to see come out of this endeavor?
Yeah, I really think that we are, let's see, how did we put it somewhere? We really, we have 2 kind of outcomes that we're looking for. One is from our investees. We really want to show that we can accelerate their work with this kind of an investment, and that it's meaningful for them to accelerate the kind of holistic development that they do. And the second is more outward-looking, which is we really want to demonstrate to the field that this kind of product is extremely valuable. So building off of that first objective, and can be done. It can financially, it's financially possible to get a return of capital and a low return, modest return. But with a high social return. And the tracking of the outcomes is really important to us, not just to show that these types of projects work, but the linking of investing to outcomes is something that LIF cares very strongly about. I don't know if you're familiar with the book that our CEO, Nancy Andrews, collaborated on with the San Francisco Fed a couple of years ago called Investing in What Works. It's really important to us to promote the idea that we should all be investing in what works and that we should all be tracking outcomes and encouraging our partners to track outcomes so that we can show that this type of work really does have an impact and encourage the flow of funds towards the most effective programs. So I think as a pilot, that's what we're trying to demonstrate. But of course, if we're able to scale it, we would just be magnifying that impact.
Got it. Thank you.
This is Ethan. That is a helpful book. I know I have a copy on my shelf, but I believe it's still available online, or there's links to the articles within it. Right, Jonathan?
I believe so, absolutely.
Because we can send a link with the notes to that.
Yeah, and there've actually, I think there've been a couple of
follow-ups, yep.
Both of which are implicated, what counts around data, and that's actually where my last, hopefully, a quick question is. Rachel, you got into this a little bit in terms of finding, the set of outcomes that they're going to be looking for and what they're going to be measuring, and I just wanted to sort of ask/highlight whether in arriving at the things that are being measured in sort of the 3 areas that were required, the education, the early childhood, and the mixed income housing, particularly on the latter 2, is there a sense that these are widely accepted measures in those other systems? I'm asking, it's a leading question because as we're thinking about who might be potential investors in the future, one of the things that I think we've all talked about is sort of the holy grail of solving the wrong pockets problem. That if through things like Equity with a Twist, we can show these other systems that we're producing outcomes, they might actually be interested in paying for what groups are doing around community development. I just wondered if there had been thought, or if there's a sense that the measures that Bridge and Bayou are tracking are things that if we prove the outcomes and we show it to another system, that they'll say, oh, that's an outcome we care about.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a great angle, Jonathan, and I hadn't thought about it quite that way. and I think you and I should talk offline more about that, because it's a great point, and we would certainly want this to be transferable in that way. I can tell you that the way we came up with measuring these particular outcomes has a lot of research behind it. So, just to grab one of them, third grade reading and math scores, that study, there's a zillion studies to show that third grade scores are an accurate predictor of future, earnings and health and a million other things. There's a tremendous correlation between third grade. It's really part of this concept that the first X years of life matter the most in terms of development. So I think that you can back up the choice of these particular metrics, and there's a lot more detail behind this. This is just kind of the summary, but there's a lot of research that went into figuring out what we should be tracking, and I think pointing to that research should be helpful if we wanted to show that it's transferable and that other systems should care about them, because these are the metrics that translate into health and welfare for residents, no matter if you're looking at it from a lens of education or health or housing or any of those other systems.
No, thanks, Rachel. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, and I know we're winding up, but I think that you hit the nail on the head, which is, knowing how this came about, that it's really drawing sort of from those systems research. We're not, which has happened occasionally in our, is that whatever we can gather in our world, we then carry elsewhere and sort of say, here are our outcomes around these things. And I think this is great, and I'll just finish up by saying that conscious of the fact that the folks we're investing in, there's a whole other set of people. Shannon spoke earlier, and I know that lots of HPN members are trying to do this kind of work, and I have on my list to read the 10 years of lessons learned in exchanges between English housing providers and the American ones, and I think one of the relevant points that I think is really critical is sort of how do we get our folks to be able to take that next leap forward in terms of being able to move change, not just on real estate, but in neighborhoods. And one of the reasons we're so excited about Equity with a Twist is it feels like it's a tool that may help with that.
And hopefully not in quite as abrupt a fashion as the UK did their transfer years ago.
Oh, right.
That's not what we recommend in the paper.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
It's a good read. So this is Ethan again at NHC. I want to say a big thank you to Rachel, also to Shannon. That's right. We have an update. Caitlin just reminded me. NHC has a convening coming up. For those of you in the New York area or who can get to the New York area April 28th and 29th, our Solutions for Housing Communications will be held there at Baruch College. You can learn more about it at the links that we will send you in the notes, but it's really about using communications tools, especially values-based messaging, to help make both program rollout and property development financing, integrate better with communities, being able to convert community opposition to community support. I highly recommend it for folks interested in any of those aspects. And like I said, we will send links around. But again, let me say a big thanks to Rachel Bluestein, to Shannon Ross, also to Jonathan, who joined us for this, and look for more to come. Thank you all.